debut sometime in April of 2025, and they're hosting their first annual draft class of 2025. But for the purposes of this video, we are going to refer to the GFL as the Geriatric Fight League because for some reason, the GFL loves to compose their roster of UFC fighters in their late 30s to mid 40s who have retired for quite some time and have lost either their durability or their athleticism that led to their inevitable retirement. But we are not going to be talking about the fighters who are already signed into the GFL promotion. We are going to be talking about the fighters that are either on the UFC roster or the ones that have just recently gotten cut from the UFC that need to join the GFL as soon as possible. As we go along, you will start to see a common pattern regarding the fighters I highlight in this video. And without wasting any more time, let's jump right into the video. Starting off with someone that is already in talks with the GFL, Tony Ferguson. This does not need any explanation, but if you guys don't know, he's 40 years old, his athleticism is gone, and he's lost 8 fights in a row in the UFC. I don't even know how he's still on the roster because usually the UFC tell their legends to retire or don't even bother to resign them after 4 or 5 losses in a row. Yet Tony Ferguson is still in the UFC in the year of 2025. There are not any fighters in the UFC I would pick Tony Ferguson to defeat at this time, but there are a lot of legends Tony can fight in the GFL like Anthony Pettis and Benson Henderson. Plus, there are already rumors of discussions going on between Tony and the GFL, and at this point, the UFC should just cut Tony off the roster so he can fight in the Geriatric Fight League because we do not want to see Tony Ferguson get brutalized once again. We want to see Tony Ferguson go out with a dub over here. Next, we have a face that nobody really mentions, but I would love to see him in the upcoming GFL draft class. Jorge Masvidal. He's 40 years old. He's 0-4 in his last 4 fights with the UFC, and he's lost a lot of his athleticism. These are qualities that perfectly suit the GFL prospect criteria. There were rumors of him returning to the UFC, and I don't even know if the UFC actually signed him yet, but there is no reason for him to be here at this point because there are no big fights the UFC can offer Jorge Masvidal at this time without Masvidal getting absolutely starched in the first round. He was cool back in 2018 to 2020, but 5 to 7 years is a long time period for an MMA fighter, especially for a guy as old as Jorge Masvidal. Now, I don't think he would sign with the GFL because Gamebred is set for life with how much bank he's made while fighting in the UFC. But the guy really wants to fight, and if he actually does, I think the GFL is perfect for him because I reckon he beats a lot of the guys that are currently in the welterweight division. If I were a manager, I would try to get Masvidal into the GFL as soon as possible, assuming Masvidal actually wants to continue fighting. Up next, we have Pedro Munoz. He is a GFL prospect in the makings. He's 38 years old. He's lost 7 out of his last 10 fights, and he's essentially a lamb led to all the hungry wolves of the bantamweight division. Now, for the longest time, I thought you had to be the elite of this division to beat Pedro Munoz, but that does not seem to be the case anymore because he is now losing to fighters I do not rate that highly, like Kyler Phillips and Amin Zahabi. Now, unlike most of the guys I will talk about throughout this video, I don't think he is completely cooked because regardless of where his career trajectory is heading right now, he's very durable and very athletic. Those are qualities that most GFL prospects do not have because, again, they are in their late 30s to mid 40s, just like Pedro Munoz. I think he will become the next champion of the bantamweight division in the GFL. And regardless of his last few fights, he's got a hell of a chin, which most of these guys do not have. I don't know if the UFC will cut him right now, but one more loss, I think the GFL will hand this guy a very nice contract for him to sign, and that will mark the beginning of the Pedro Munoz title run at the age of 38. We're going to move on to someone who can achieve John Jones level legacy over here at the GFL. Let me tell you guys about this guy named Anthony Lionheart Smith. Now, his fighter name is called Lionheart for a reason, you know? Nobody can hold on to a 2-on-1 wrist control on bottom position quite like Anthony Smith. And as Joe Rogan would say, people forget, man. Prime Anthony Smith. He was a monster. He beat up legends of the game like Rashad Evans. All right, in all seriousness, there is no point in him being in the UFC. At this point, the only purpose he serves to being on the roster is to promote an upcoming hype train and have those guys knock out Anthony Smith in like the first round or two. I think I speak for a lot of people when I say this, but I do not want to see Anthony Smith fight. It is the most depressing shit you can watch. There's always a sequence within his fights where he's in the feeble position, doing just enough to stay in the fight, but not nearly enough to try and win, and it just feels like a waste of time. What the fuck is the point of Anthony Smith even being in the UFC right now? We have other guys in the division that could serve as gatekeepers like Volkan Uzdemir. And I actually rate Volkan Uzdemir as a good martial artist, unlike Anthony Smith. With my rant about Anthony Smith to the side, if he joins the GFL, that's a different story. I think he can do very well there because the GFL consists of a bunch of unks in their early to mid 40s coming out of retirement, especially in the light heavyweight division. I don't think any of these guys on the roster can bully Smith into holding 2-on-1 wrist control for 15 minutes straight. And I reckon Anthony Smith can definitively become the GFL GOAT. But here in the UFC, he serves little to no purpose for the division, other than to remind us how dog shit the light heavyweight division truly is. Moving back to the lightweight division, Clay Guida, 43 years of age, lost his last 3 fights in the UFC, and he's lost a lot of his toughness and durability, which made him so hard to beat in his prime. Like, does that not sound like a prime GFL prospect material for you guys? I think the UFC just released Guida recently, and if the GFL manages to bring this guy into the draft, that will be really hype. I don't know if they'll sign Guida, but they should. It's not like they had any problem signing a bunch of other old heads in their mid 40s that retired from the UFC years ago. And if Guida still wants to fight, have him in the GFL because he fits just right in and he can actually beat some of the guys on this roster. Last but not least, I want to include a female prospect for the GFL to acquire because I feel like I have been scrutinizing women on this channel way too much, calling some of them prostitutes while judging others on attributes outside of their fighting capabilities. So, for the first time ever, I want to include a legitimate female prospect in my video, and that will be Holm. Holm will put up Amanda Nunes type of title defenses if she joins the GFL Women's Bantamweight division. I don't know any of the girls on the roster for this division, but I know Holm is very tricky to beat, even for most UFC fighters right now. I think the UFC just released her recently and agreed that she can go explore other options. Why not the GFL? The GFL really needs this sign because I don't see anyone on the bantamweight roster I would count as a pay-per-view draw. For strawweight, you have Paige Van Zandt. You have Jessica Penne at atomweight. Why not get another former UFC fighter in the GFL women's roster in Holly Holm? Plus, Holly Holm is a former champion. That's going to be big for the GFL to acquire her because she fits the GFL prospect criteria at the age of 43, I believe, and she has a lot of credentials that most fighters in her division don't. Assuming Holly Holm still wants to fight, I think she will be a great addition for the GFL roster. All right, that's going to be it for today's video. Like I said, I'm really hyped to see the GFL host their first annual draft class of 2025. And hopefully, we get to see a lot of familiar faces. And let me know in the comments down below who you guys want to see the GFL acquire in the near future. But other than that, make sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time. Peace.